Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. Betty opened her eyes with difficulty. Her whole body ached from her arms. The IV wires were sticking out. Her mouth tasted of blood, and she was thirsty. Every movement was difficult. The woman tried to remember the previous events. Here, she and her husband were driving home from the anniversary of his business partner. He sat behind the wheel himself. Although he had drunk quite a lot during the holidays, at first everything was fine. They were almost home. Then Betty remembers the headlights shining in her face. And then the impact. Someone called the paramedics. It felt like the ambulance came pretty fast. They loaded her into the car. What happened next? And the woman didn't know, because after she was loaded into the ambulance, she passed out. I woke up just now. A nurse came into the room. She asked how the patient was feeling. What about my husband? Did he go well? He wasn't hurt. As far as I know, he's being questioned by the police. Why he swerved into the oncoming lane and his blood alcohol test. The car you collided with was unlucky. The impact threw it several meters to the side. The man behind the wheel is badly hurt, and there's little chance of him surviving. What's going to happen to my husband now? I don't know, indifferently, shrugged the nurse. Most likely he will be taken to the station, as there is no threat to his life. The woman was very frightened. It seemed to her that the nurse spoke to her with a kind of contempt, and she was not mistaken. Through her husband's fault, an innocent man was likely to die, and her husband hadn't even scratched himself in the accident. Betty told him not to drive. She asked him to call a cab, but he wouldn't. And this is the result. Maybe it was for the best. Betty thought as she drifted off to sleep. She met her husband about 5 years ago. Betty had been working late that night and didn't have money for a cab. So the woman decided to go to the bus stop and wait for the bus, which was now running with a break of at least half an hour. As luck would have it, it was raining heavily outside, and she did not have an umbrella with her. As she approached the stop, she noticed that the bus had just pulled away from her. What kind of bad luck is this? Betty muttered to himself. Now I could stand here for another half hour. 5 minutes later, however, a car pulled up right in front of her. An expensive foreign car. From the passenger side opened the window and a pleasant male voice spoke. "Girl, can I give you a ride?" No, Betty replied fearfully. "I'm waiting for the bus." "Thank you." "Don't worry, I won't eat you," the man continued. "The weather's so nasty, and you're wearing such a thin jacket. Sit down." Betty thought that this man didn't look like a maniac, though she didn't know much about cars, but she realized that a car like this wasn't cheap. She nodded her head and carefully got into the passenger seat. The car started up. "Where are you going?" the driver asked. "I'm going to 5th Avenue. There's a shopping center not far away." "That's great. That's the neighborhood I'm looking for." They drove in silence for a while. Suddenly, the man spoke. "My name is Jacob, and your name is Betty, a woman. And let me ask you, Betty, what such a young and beautiful girl was doing at the bus stop at such a late hour? Aren't you scared to walk alone?" "I was on my way home from work. I was late," Betty answered briefly, not wanting to go into details. Jacob liked this woman at first sight, and he was the kind of man who always took what he wanted. So now he had decided that Betty was bound to be his. He parked the car at his destination. "How much do I owe you?" Betty asked. "Really, I don't have much money on me at all." "Betty, do I look like someone who needs money?" he asked with a chuckle. "No, but I'm used to having to pay for every job." "Okay, well, give me your phone number. I'll call you one of these days and invite you in for a cup of coffee." Betty smiled slightly and dictated her number to the man. After that, she said goodbye and got out of the car. Jacob turned around with a satisfied look and went about his business. He got what he wanted, as he always did. Betty's life went on from there. Jacob did not call her, and the woman decided that he would not call her. After all, why would someone like him need a simple wiretap? Like her? Well, on Friday, Betty received a message from an unknown number to pick you up. Tomorrow at 5 sharp, we'll be ready by this time. Jacob, I don't remember us using the first name, Betty said out loud. Who does he think he is? So what if he's rich? He thinks everyone should bow down to him now. No, you can't do that to me. Despite her indignation, the woman decided to go to the cafe with Jacob, but to tell him what she thought. Betty was ready on time, and already at 5 p.m. was standing near the entrance. I love punctual girls, the man remarked instead of greeting her. Look, Jacob, you and I don't seem to have crossed a friendly foot. If you've bailed me out once, that doesn't give you an excuse to talk to me like that. You got a temper, don't you? The man grinned. I like that kind of girl. What do you think you're doing? Betty was indignant and tried to get out of the car. Yes, wait, I didn't mean to offend you. I'm just used to talking to people as equals. If that's the way you want it, then please, I'll only call you by your first name. Betty agreed with Jacob, and he, in turn, realized that this girl was not as simple as she seemed. Jacob wooed Betty very nicely. Woman, at first thought that he was just having a good time with her, and no serious relationship they could not have. But she still wanted to be close to him. Everything was too beautiful and like a fairy tale. She decided for herself that if Jacob decided to break off the relationship with her, she would still have these unforgettable impressions of a beautiful life in her memory. However, Jacob's intentions turned out to be more than serious. Already in 6 months, he made her an offer. But the woman did not immediately agree to it, although she really wanted to. She long tried to understand why a successful and wealthy man who can marry any beauty, moreover, with a rich dowry, needs such a mediocre bride. But Jacob insisted, and Betty finally agreed to become his wife. The wedding was a lavish affair that any woman would envy. Lots of guests, a huge selection of food and drink. The bride's dress was from a famous Italian designer. After the ceremony, Jacob drove Betty. She still had a hard time believing in the reality of what was happening. But any fairy tale sooner or later comes to an end. When the newlyweds returned home, Jacob insisted on firing Betty. At first it was just hints. Then they turned into requests, and then into demands. Eventually, the woman gave in and quit. She should have noticed the change in her husband's attitude even then. Betty was too fond of her new well-fed and beautiful life. She decided that she could well tolerate her spouse's whims. But it only got worse from there. Jacob began to control every step, checked the biography of all her friends, all the time called and demanded a report on her movements. After a few months, Betty couldn't take the pressure. I decided to talk to my husband in the evening, when the man was working in his office. She cautiously entered his office and sat down in the chair across from him. We need to have a serious talk with you. Betty began. Jacob, let's not do this right now. I'm very busy. No, Jacob, it's urgent. I can't wait any longer, and I can't take all this abuse. The man immediately broke away from the papers and looked at his wife with interest. What kind of abuse is this? You can't stand it, he smiled. Yours. Are you always watching me? You won't let me hang out with anyone. I can't go for a regular walk without you yanking me every 5 minutes. Well, I'm sorry. I'm just looking out for your safety. I don't know who might want to mess with me through you. I'd rather watch you now than deal with the consequences later. Don't you get it? Betty started screaming. I'm a human being, not a doll. I'm your wife, not a slave. Wael told Jacob with pressure to stop the hysterics. You want to live a beautiful life, and you have to pay for it. So kindly accept my rules and don't make any more scenes. You're bored. Ask a friend to come over. I don't know what kind of girlfriends you're checking up on. They're all gone. I don't have anyone to invite. That's a problem. Get new ones. No, Jacob, we can't go on like this. I'm leaving you. With these words, Betty got up from the chair and wanted to head for the exit. But the man stopped her. Sit down in a calm and somehow frightening voice, he said, and listen to me carefully, and I won't let you behave like that. No woman in the world dare to divorce me. If you even once more for their books that you are going to leave, you're not going to get away with it. You know what I mean." Betty looked at her husband in silence. It was the first time she had ever seen him like this, and it frightened her. "But why don't you say anything?" Jacob asked, in the same voice. "Answer me." "I understand you," whispered Betty. "I can go now." Jacob slowly approached his wife and gave her his hand. Betty stood up from the chair, whereupon the man pulled her tightly against him. The woman's heart was beating at breakneck speed. "Don't be afraid," Jacob said, as gently as possible. "I love you very much, but I will not let you play with yourself. You are mine and mine alone, and don't make me remind you of that again." The man released his wife from his embrace and said, "Now you can go. I still have work to do. Go to bed, and I will join you a little later." Betty, without saying a word, left the office and went up to the bedroom. The woman had no idea how to go on living after what she had heard. Had Betty's attitude toward her husband changed much since then? She kept remembering his words and threats. Jacob, on the contrary, behaved as if nothing had happened. He spoiled his wife with gifts, took her to luxurious restaurants, and gave her huge bouquets of flowers every day. Betty was completely confused. She didn't know how to react to all this. After all, she was not a toy, but a living person. She can't be treated like this. But she couldn't leave Jacob yet. The woman hadn't worked for months, even though she still had that dingy apartment. Betty had nothing else and was unlikely to get a good job quickly. And Jacob would probably make every effort to ensure that no one would accept her. The woman would be left with no means of livelihood at all. So Betty saw two ways out of the situation: wait until Jacob himself lost interest in her, or to accumulate a safety cushion, choose the right moment and divorce her husband, deciding that both options require time. She began to secretly save money from Jacob. Certainly wouldn't be superfluous. Thought of Betty. Time passed, but Jacob never even considered leaving Betty. He loved her. He loved her in his own way with jealousy and constant control, but he loved her all the same. But the man had business problems. Competitors decided to buy out his firm on very unfavorable terms for him, and in case of refusal promised problems with suppliers and customers, which gradually and carried out. Jacob had already lost 2 major clients, which could not but affect his income. He even had to lay off some of his employees, including his driver, in order to save some money. But he wasn't about to give up his lifestyle. Betty decided that this situation could play into her hands. But on the other hand, she could not abandon her husband at such a difficult time in his life. Jacob, wanting to find a way out of his unpleasant situation, began to look for new connections among those who could help him. And he managed to interest in a proposal of cooperation of one influential man in the city, who later became his partner. Things began to slowly get better. Jacob found a new client thanks to his partner, for which he was very grateful. And one day Jacob received an invitation to an anniversary party from his new partner. There were no reasons for refusal, and the man together with Betty went to the party. Jacob had fired his driver when there were still financial difficulties, and he never hired a new one. So the man drove his own car. The party was a top-notch affair. Jacob managed to make some useful new acquaintances. What couldn't be said about Betty? She was bored among these people. She pretended to be sick and asked Jacob to let her go home in a cab. But he decided to drive his wife himself, especially since he had already made all the necessary acquaintances. Betty asked him not to drive after so much alcohol. But the man did not listen to his wife, saying that he is no longer a boy and can make such decisions himself. In the end, Betty ended up with injuries in the hospital in the next room. On the verge of life and death lay a young boy who had been run over by her husband, and Jacob himself was being questioned by the police. Will woke up the next morning. A now familiar nurse glared at her bedside and was doing something with her IV. Noticing that Betty had opened her eyes, she turned to her. "How are you feeling?" In an indifferent voice, asked the nurse. I don't know if I answered. Probably like any other person after an accident. The police want to talk to you. Can you do that now? Yes, of course, said Betty confusedly. The nurse headed for the exit, but the woman stopped her. Wait, how's the guy my husband and I hit? I didn't think you'd be interested in that. Although you probably just want to figure out what kind of punishment to expect for your spouse. Well, I can tell you this. The boy survived tonight, which is a good sign. His chances of living are greatly improved, although the consequences could be very unpleasant. His spine is damaged, and he'll probably never walk again. What a nightmare. Betty whispered, yes, your husband's going to do a lot of time. The nurse grinned evilly and left the room. A few minutes later, a man in a police uniform came in to see Betty. Betty, he said, yes, that's me. And my name is Kevin. I want to ask you some questions about yesterday's incident. Do you mind? Sure, I'll answer all your questions. Thank you. We spoke to your husband yesterday, but for the sake of completeness, we need to hear your side of the story. Do you remember exactly what happened? Yeah, we were driving home from the suburbs. At some point, Jacob swerved the car to the left, and we were apparently in the oncoming lane. Then the impact happened. That's all I can tell you. Tell me, Betty, do you have a driver's license? Do you know how to drive? No. Why do you ask? They're just standard questions. The cop was lying. What he really needed to figure out was what Jacob had said was true and what was fiction. Fired the husband tried to frame his wife by saying that she was the one driving that night and a car came in front of them, and she was just trying to avoid a collision. But one thing he hadn't considered was that the police would be so quick to question his wife. Jacob thought he would have time for him to tell her what to say and how to say it so that no one would get in trouble. And what would happen to the injured guy Jacob didn't care at all. Betty, did your husband ever drive drunk? The police officer continued his questioning. No, it was one time. He used to have a driver who always drove him. Now he had to fire him because of financial difficulties, so Jacob started driving himself. Thank you, Betty, for your answers. You've been very helpful. Tell me, Kevin, what are my husband's chances? It depends on how the other party to the accident feels. But in any case, your husband will not be able to avoid criminal punishment because through his fault was caused serious harm to health. You can only use the services of a good lawyer. Perhaps he will help to reduce the term of punishment, although it is unlikely that he will succeed. Why? Because I'm the victim, the kid, the son of a deputy from a neighboring region. I think you understand that his father will try to maximize the punishment for the perpetrator. I understand. Thank you. Betty replied quietly. The policemen left the room. Now he had no doubt that Jacob had been driving the car. What kind of despicable man is this? How could you shift your guilt onto another person, especially a woman? His own wife. Kevin swore quietly. In his many years of service, he had never gotten used to human meanness and betrayal. Here. And now he was ready to fight for this man to get what he deserved. The policeman dialed the number of his employee and told him to take Jacob into custody. After all, yesterday, based on his testimony, the man had been released on his own recognizance. Now he can't get out of this story that easily. Jacob was dealing with his biggest problem. When the doorbell rang, "Who the hell is that?" A man burst out. There was a police squad standing on the doorstep. Jacob, well, he answered dismissively. Do you need to come with us to the station? You are suspected of committing a traffic accident causing serious harm to the health of third parties. What's this all of a sudden? I told your superiors what happened yesterday. All questions to my wife, who was driving, but she's not in a position to answer them yet. And we're the injured party. We were hit by that crazy guy in the 6. You're gonna have to ask him. We've already taken your wife's statement, but that, as you put it, crazy guy is in intensive care. We don't know if he's gonna live. And his father is unlikely to let you get away with it. Stop. Jacob was outraged. When did my wife have time to talk to you? She's in the hospital, and hasn't come to her senses yet, as far as I know. You are mistaken. She's perfectly capable of speaking and testifying, so you better watch what you say. Otherwise, you could be in a worse position if you give false ones. What a bastard. Irritated, Jacob cursed. Jacob, let's not do that. Politely asked one of the police officers carrying out the detention. And you do not show me here. So it is already an insult to an official on duty. Guys, let's handcuff him. And let's go. Jacob tried to resist, but it was stupid, given his position and the strength of the police officers. Half an hour later, he was already being questioned by an investigator, who informed him of his wife's statement and hinted at who the injured guy was. So the best thing the man could do now was to tell the truth and cooperate with the investigation. Jacob had no choice but to comply, but he demanded an attorney, refusing to speak without one. Thus began the investigation and the trial. In the meantime, Betty was on the mend. She could already walk independently around the hospital, but it was strange to her that her husband still had not given any news about himself. The woman figured he was just minding his own business and was no longer interested in her. Betty was far from how cases were investigated, so she did not even suggest that Jacob might be in the detention center, and with his money, he could pay her off. That's what she thought. She was walking down the hospital corridor one day when she saw a young man being moved into one of the rooms, followed by the policeman who had come to see her. Betty immediately realized that this was the same victim that Jacob had driven into. Curiosity got the better of the woman, and she cautiously approached the room to overhear the conversation. The family of the perpetrator of the accident had already been apprehended. A familiar Betty voice said, "Your father will be here soon. He's been informed that you've regained consciousness." Shit, that's the last thing I need is my father here. How am I going to explain everything to him? Sam, why did you do all this? You stole someone else's car, got behind the wheel without a license, and drove off. Where the hell are you going? Yeah, 'cause my dad was a real pain in the ass. I wanted to get out of his care and do something about it. Sam, you're gonna be crippled for life. Do you realize that? Suddenly, Betty called out from behind me. Are you doing something? It was the same nurse who was doing Betty. You don't belong here, or are you trying to bribe the victim? Are you getting ready? What are you talking about? The woman was indignant. Why would I want to bribe him? I'm only interested in his fortune. You rich people are all the same. First you do the deed, and then you hide. And you think, who would you bring money to whitewash yourselves? And the guy, by the way, he survived by a miracle. He'll probably be in a wheelchair from now on. Are you and your husband gonna be okay? I don't know. Betty silently looked at the nurse with surprised eyes. Now she understood why she had been so rude to her all this time. Look, I don't want to bribe anyone, and I don't have the money myself, and I don't know what my husband's plans are. He hasn't even come to see me once in all this time. Maybe he's out of town. Kevin came out of the victim's room. What's going on here? He asked angrily. Oh, it's you, Betty. I've been meaning to talk to you. We can go to your room. Of course, Betty answered quietly. When they entered, the policeman closed the door behind him and told Betty about her husband's affairs. The investigation had already fully proved his guilt. The materials have been transferred to the court, and the hearing will take place as early as next week. Jacob had no chance of remaining free. The victim's father made every effort to ensure that he received as much time as possible. As it turned out, Jacob was riding in the car of an 18-year-old boy who stole or simply arranged to borrow a car from an acquaintance to escape from his parents. His father doesn't have that much influence in this town, but still, he has just as much money as Jacob. Tears rolled down Betty's cheeks. She felt sorry for the injured boy, scared for Jacob, even though she didn't love him anymore. Still, he was not a stranger to her, and she was worried about him. And most importantly, it was unclear what she should do now, how to live with this burden. Betty woke up from an incomprehensible rumble, opened her eyes. The woman saw an unfamiliar man in an expensive suit and a robe thrown over his shoulders. "The ancient creatures have threatened my son, and now you live your life in peace. Yes, I made your life a living hell. You and your apprentice will go to hard labor for the rest of your life. Who are you and what do you want?" Betty asked fearfully, although she had already guessed who this visitor was. "I am your nightmare from this minute, and for the rest of your life." Betty sat up on the bed. The sleep had finally receded. She looked at the man carefully. "You will stop screaming. I can understand your condition, and I sincerely sympathize with you. But this grief does not give you any right to behave like this with a stranger, especially without knowing all the details of what happened." The next few days were completely uneventful. She socialized with Sam. The guy turned out to be a very developed and interesting conversationalist. Betty was surprised that at 32 she could communicate so easily and freely with an 18-year-old boy. Sam's father did not show up again. He was too busy with Jacob's lawsuit. Meanwhile, Betty was preparing for her discharge. She had a lot of important things ahead of her. Betty could not leave the hospital without saying goodbye to Sam. The evening before discharge day, she went to his room as usual. They talked a lot about life, their families, their dreams. "Sam, what happened to your mom? Why did your father come to see you alone and I never saw her?" "I don't have a mom," the guy simply answered. "What do you mean?" Betty was surprised. "It's like this. When I was 5 years old, she left my father for some richer man 20 years older than her. She hasn't even been interested in me or my life since." Dad, of course, did not grieve long about it, and spite everyone, in 6 months brought a young new blonde into the house and soon married her. Naturally, she did not need neither my father nor I am interested in Daddy's money connections. But apparently, it suits him. So all these years she lives with us. I can't say we have a warm relationship. More like neighbors. What a hard fate you've had. With sympathy, Betty said, "It's all right. I've accepted it. I guess it's more interesting than living off the land. At least I've seen something in my short life." "You don't say. You've got so much more to see." "There's not much to see lying in bed, Sam, but you can try to do something. I mean, there are cases where people have recovered from injuries like this. Does your father have money? I don't think he'd spare any money for your recovery." "Betty, do you believe it yourself?" "I do," the woman replied firmly. "So do you." "Okay, thank you. Sam, I actually came to tell you that I'm being discharged tomorrow, and I won't be seeing you here again. And I don't know if I'll ever see you again. I want to get away from all this, divorce Jacob, sell the apartment, buy a train ticket and go somewhere where no one will ever find me. But I'm sorry to leave you. I've grown so attached to you these days. You're a really nice guy, but your father won't approve of us hanging out, but I still want to leave you my number. If you want, you can call me any time of the day or night, and I'll be ready to hear from you. I'm sorry to part with you too." Sam answered quietly, as if he was embarrassed. "If we had met under different circumstances, I would have definitely asked you to go out with me." Sam lowered his eyes in embarrassment. He couldn't tell Betty directly how he felt, afraid of being rejected. But in the days they had known each other, the guy had fallen head over heels in love with her. "Sam, what are you talking about? What does this have to do with circumstances? I'm 14 years older than you. What kind of couple would we make? You're very nice. I'm sure you'll meet a girl worthy of you and age appropriate. Why would you want a grown-up woman with a lot of problems and a bad marriage?" Betty tried to make a joke. "It's not an aunt," Sam resented. "Okay, I'm gonna go. It's late. Call me if you need anything." Betty went back to her room. She collapsed on her bed and began to think about the words she had said to Sam. She was worried about that sweet guy being so attached to her and harboring false feelings. Betty realized the absurdity of the situation. "Okay," she said out loud. "I'll leave. He'll forget me, and everything will be fine. You talk to me some more. I'm not gonna let you guys get away with this. I'm done talking." With that, the man turned around and left the room. slamming the door loudly. Betty was left sitting motionless. She couldn't even imagine what to expect from this man. After sitting for about half an hour, the woman decided to go check on Sama, the guy who had been injured in the accident. She approached the room and knocked gently, but no one answered her. Then Betty opened the door ajar. "Can we come in?" she asked. There was still no answer. Then the woman entered the room and saw Sam lying on the bed, looking up at the ceiling. "Hi," Betty said. "Hello. And who else are you?" inquired Sam in response. "My name is Betty. I was a passenger in the car that hit you. What did you want?" "You must be thinking about my father, that I sixed him on you." "Well, you're wrong. I don't blame you or your husband for anything. It's my own fault. I shouldn't have started all this. I'd be at home in the warmth and comfort of my own home, well-fed and contented. No, I wanted my freedom. I'm really sorry about what happened. I know it sounds stupid, and it's not gonna make things right, but I'm sorry." Sam looked at Betty with surprise. "Forgive you for what? It's not like you had anything to do with it. You were in the passenger side, and I was hit by the driver, your husband. Is that correct?" "Yes, my husband. Only he's never gonna admit he's to blame for anything in his life. He'll blame everyone around him, but not him. And I don't think he cares about anyone else but himself. Maybe now he'll realize something. You talk as if you're glad he's in trouble." Betty had a hard time admitting it, but she did feel a certain amount of joy that Jacob might get a real sentence. "Maybe you're right," she sighed. "That way I'd have at least a chance to get away and divorce him. Wasn't there any way to do it without it?" "Apparently not," the woman replied sadly. "He's very possessive. I felt like a prisoner around him, and I couldn't leave. He promised me such problems as well as your father. But it means my victim didn't try to smile in vain." "Did my father threaten you?" "Yeah, he came by today, yelling and cursing. Don't worry about it. I didn't come to you to complain or beg. Save me from him. I'm sorry again. I'm really sorry about what happened." "You're good. Thank you, Sam. What was the big rush, if it's no secret?" "It's no secret. I wanted to start my own life, probably just like you. I wanted freedom from my parents. I was tired of being constantly controlled. My father was always forcing me to study. He paid for me to go to law school, which wasn't my thing. I wanted to do music. Me and my boys had a band. But my parents made me give it up, saying I'd never do anything good with music. So I decided to run away. I saved up some money, borrowed a friend's car, got in, and drove off. Wherever the hell I wanted to go." Betty couldn't hold back her tears. She felt so sorry for this guy who had such grandiose dreams, such will to achieve them, and determination. And now, because of her husband, he had lost everything. Now Sam's whole life is just lying in bed. He's unlikely to have a wife and children. He won't be able to play his favorite guitar anymore. He won't even be a lawyer like his parents wanted him to be. "Betty, don't cry. There's nothing you can do about it. It's what someone wanted. I'll talk to your father, and I promise you he won't hurt you." "Thank you, Sam," Betty said gratefully. She went back to her room. The woman felt a little better. His father is a rich man with connections. He could probably help his son get back on his feet, and he would be fine. The next day, Betty checked out and went home. The first thing she needed to do was to find out how Jacob was doing, but how to do that? The woman didn't understand yet. She didn't have the contacts of the policemen who had come to see her. Who else could she call? She didn't know. Eventually, Betty found their precinct officer's number on the internet, and after an hour of negotiating and calling various authorities, she was given the number of Kevin, who was handling the case. She dialed the number and heard the familiar voice of a senior lieutenant speaking. "Hello, my name is Betty. You handled my husband Jacob's case. Yes, I understand what you wanted. I was wondering how he's doing. How did the trial end? Maybe I'm in the wrong place, but I don't know who I can get information from. He's my husband, and I want to know how he's doing. He was sentenced to 1.5 years in prison with a fine. He was lucky that the victim survived and his father could not seriously influence the court's decision. If you want to meet him, come to the detention center. Kevin gave Betty the address and said goodbye. The woman began to wonder whether she should see her husband after everything that had happened, or whether she should run away without a second thought. She was confused. On the one hand, she realized that the best thing to do was to run away now without saying anything to Jacob. On the other hand, she felt sorry for her husband. After all, they were close to him, and they were connected, albeit short, but family life. In the end, the woman decided that she should meet with her husband at least to inform him about the divorce. What if this situation had taught him something? Betty reasoned. Maybe he'd learned that you can't be so stubborn and selfish. Then there's a chance for reconciliation in our family. Everyone deserves a second chance. With these thoughts, Betty changed her clothes, cleaned herself up, and went to the address she had been given. Once there, the woman saw a gray, gloomy building with bars on the windows. Behind a high fence with barbed wire at the gate stood 2 sentries. Betty walked past them, feeling an inexplicable fear and panic inspired by the place. She was met at the entrance by the officer on duty. "Hello, who are you here to see?" he asked. "Good afternoon. I was told I could meet my husband. He was recently convicted, and they brought him to you. Can I see your identification, please?" Jacob answered Betty, holding out a passport to the officer on duty. "Sit down. I'll find out everything now." The officer on duty called someone on the phone, asked something, and after a couple of minutes turned to Betty. "Follow me." He led the woman into a special room for dates. From the furniture, there was a table and 2 chairs opposite each other. "Have a seat. Your husband will be right with you." Betty sat down on one of the chairs. She noticed at once that it was terribly uncomfortable. Apparently, it was designed so that people wouldn't stay here long. Jacob entered the room 5 minutes later. He looked wrinkled. His face was covered with stubble. His hair shot up, and bruises were visible under his eyes. Talking about clearly not giving himself away. "Hi," Betty said hello quietly. "How are you? Can't you see?" Jacob replied with a grin. "And I'm resting here, like in a sanatorium." "Jacob, don't be sarcastic. I don't mean you any harm, do I?" The man shouted indignantly. "And who told the cops?" "That it was me who got behind the wheel and hit that puppy drunk. Wasn't it you, dear wife?" "What did I say wrong?" Betty was surprised. "They came and asked me what happened. So I told them. Didn't you think with your empty head that you should have asked me first what you could and couldn't say? I would have told them you were the one driving. We'd both be home right now and have no problems. And you're the bitch who ratted me out." "Jacob, stop it. How dare you accuse me of anything? I'm not the one who put you behind the wheel like that. Yeah, that poor guy was lucky to be alive. You ruined his life. I don't give a shit about some guy. I'm more interested in my own life. And it's going downhill right now. So you listen to me. You go home now. You'll find it. I have Kevin's phone number in my address book. You're gonna call him, and you're gonna describe the situation. Then you're gonna do whatever he says to get me out of here. Got it? Why didn't you call them yourself?" "I didn't have time. I didn't think it would happen so fast. Do you know what you have to do? I'm asking you." "Jacob, I'm not going to help you. I don't understand how I could marry such a monster. You don't see anyone but yourself. You don't need anyone. I'm filing for divorce, and you can't stop me. I'll get you out from under the ground. You'll be paying me back for the rest of your life. All the money I spent on you." "What else?" Jacob didn't get a chance to finish because a policeman entered the room. "Your date is over. Citizen out, and you get up and go back to your cell. Anyway, you got me." Angry sounded Jacob. Betty quickly grabbed her bag and ran out of the building. She regretted that she had even ventured into this meeting with her husband in the first place. What a tyrant he'd been, he was still a tyrant, or maybe even worse. Betty walked slowly toward the bus stop, wondering what to do next. Betty's first order of business was to file for divorce from Jacob. There was no doubt in her mind now that this man would never change, and living with him would be hell to stay in his house. Betty didn't want to stay in his house either. So after packing up her belongings and accumulated money, the woman left this place for good. Back in her marital apartment, Betty decided that the most correct thing would be to formalize the divorce through the court. She filed a statement of claim and waited for the result. She was immediately warned that such cases usually take 1 to 3 months. After that, Betty began to look for a buyer for her apartment. The woman wanted to get rid of everything that kept her here in this city, to escape once and for all. So she asked for the minimum price for her place just to sell it quickly. She got lucky. A young man named Thomas was looking for a suitable apartment in the area to start a family. He was completely satisfied with Betty's price offer, and the apartment itself was a great option. All he had to do was to wait for a reply from the bank, which had to approve the mortgage for Thomas. This also took about a month. The woman was out of luck. The judge divorced her and Jacob already at the first meeting, which took place 3 weeks after the application was filed. Almost immediately after that, the bank approved Thomas' mortgage, and she and Betty signed a contract for the sale of the apartment. Now there was nothing to keep her here at all. After packing the most necessary things, Betty went to the train station. The woman decided that she wanted to start a new life with a clean slate, so she would not take a lot of things with her. After all, she now had enough money to provide herself with everything she needed. Half an hour later, she was standing in front of the ballet ticket offices at the train station and choosing her destination. She knew for sure that she would not go to the big city, but rather to a place where Jacob would not even think of looking for her, some small, cozy town. The choice was Minnesota. True, it would take a few days to get there, but that was even better. Her train was leaving in 3 hours after the choice was made, and the tickets were in the hands of the woman. She was able to relax a bit. The woman deposited her suitcase in the luggage room and decided to walk around the city a bit to see it for what she thought would be the last time. There was a small park not far from the train station. Betty decided to go there. She bought a cup of ice cream and sat down on a bench. Suddenly, her cell phone rang. The call was from an unknown number. The woman was afraid to answer it at first. 2 disturbing thoughts arose in her head at once. It was a call from Jacob, who had heard about the divorce, or from Sam's father, whose threats Betty hadn't forgotten, although he hadn't shown himself in any way. Betty gingerly pressed the answer button. "Hello," the woman said in a shaky voice. "Hi, I'm the one who recognized it." Sam clarified Betty and exhaled in relief. "Well, yes, you said I could call you for anything." "Of course you can. I thought you were going to call me a little earlier." "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't have time to raise my dad," the guy laughed. "I'm glad you're in a good mood. How are you?" "I'm finally getting out of that awful hospital." "Well, that's great news, Sam. I'm so happy for you. They also said I have a chance at recovery, but you have to fly to Germany to do it, so I'm flying out tomorrow." "That's great, Sam. I told you there was more to come." "Yeah. How about you? You divorced your husband." "Divorced?" Betty sighed. "I sold my apartment, and now I'm sitting by the train station waiting for my train." "How far are you going?" Not far to Minnesota." "Oh, why'd you choose this place to live?" "I don't." "Well, Sam, it's a nice riverside town. Beautiful, green. I've always wanted to live by the river. And here I won't have to be afraid of Jacob. I don't think he'd think to look for me there." "Good then. It's always nice when dreams come true at a housewarming party. You'll invite me. I just have to buy a place to live, get a job, find a job, and do all the things that life in a new place requires. But I kind of can't go right now either. You know, it's a long way to Germany, and it will take a long time to recover, so don't expect it any sooner than 6 months." "That's a deal. Good luck, Sam." "Thanks, Jacob. You too." After talking to Sam, the woman felt a little calmer. She believed that the operation would help him get back on his feet and that he would be able to live a full life. Betty had a new life ahead of her, where there would be no more room for people like her husband. Betty stepped off the train, and the bright summer sun hit her eyes. The woman looked around. Everything was somehow foreign and completely unfamiliar. While Betty was in town, she thought about how she would settle into her new place. The woman managed to look at several advertisements for apartments for sale. She had enough money to buy a one-bedroom apartment and still have some money left over to live on. Betty decided to rent a bed in the church while she searched for a suitable option. Of course, she could afford a nice hotel room, but Betty decided that it would be best to save as much money as possible and not spend it on any extravagances. After all, it was still unknown how the job situation would turn out and how long the search would take. To her surprise, the room was very clean and spacious. There weren't many guests, so it fell with the neighbors. It turned out to be just two girls, students traveling in Russian cities. Betty did not dare to deal with the purchase of the apartment on her own, so she turned to a real estate agency. She described her wishes and waited for a suitable option. In the end, 3 days later, the realtor called Betty and offered several apartments for sale in the center of the city at very attractive prices. The woman decided to look at each of them. The first apartment was in an old house on the first floor. According to the seller, this apartment was inherited from his grandmother about a year ago. This immediately scared people away. They did not want to live in an apartment where someone had recently died. The second apartment was in a newer building with good repairs. But even there, the woman felt uncomfortable, although she couldn't explain why. The last option was located on the 8th floor of a 9-story building. It had a beautiful view of the river. Betty fell in love with the apartment immediately. Despite the fact that it was a little smaller than the previous options, the woman felt at home in it. Everything was good here. A beautiful view from the window, comfortable layout, modern renovations. Betty decided it was okay to settle on this option. The realtor promised to prepare a sales contract, and the next week, Betty would be able to move into the new apartment. All this time, Betty had been corresponding with Sam. He told her about Germany, about how great and beautiful it was there. Even from the window of the hospital he was in, he had a beautiful view of the architecture of the city. They were preparing him for surgery, collecting all the necessary tests. In turn, Betty shared with him her impressions of her new place of residence, bragged about her future apartment. Sam approved her choice and promised to come to visit her immediately after returning to the USA. And the deal to buy the apartment was successful. Gradually, Betty bought everything she needed for her new home. Now it was possible to look for a job. The difficulty was that Betty had not worked for a long time, so all her previous work experience was not so important to the employer. The woman went on interviews, but there was no result. She was either offered a salary that was too low, with irregular working hours, or promised to call back at all. And that was the end of it. And after 2 months, she got lucky. A large company from another city was opening a branch in Minnesota and was recruiting new employees for the team. Betty responded to one of these vacancies, and after an interview, she was offered a good position with a decent salary. So went the usual work routine. In the meantime, Sam had an operation. It was successful. Now the guy was engaged in recovery procedures. He could sit up freely and tried to stand on his feet. There was no talk of full-fledged mobility yet, but the doctors gave positive forecasts, promising that in 6 months, Sam would be able to walk unaided. His father did not spare any money for his son's recovery, and it paid off. The time flew by very quickly. More fully settled in a new place, she liked her new life. The woman had new, interesting acquaintances and even began to establish a personal life. One evening after work, she went to her favorite pastry shop. Betty wanted to take her favorite cake to celebrate the successful completion of a project at work. But it turned out to be the last one, and some man asked him to give up this cake for his favorite daughter, who won a sports competition today and wants it as a present. Betty couldn't help but give in to the child. And the man, a little embarrassed, inquired about Betty's plans for the evening. They struck up a conversation. The man's name was Robert. It turned out that he was raising his daughter all alone. His wife had died in a plane crash a few years ago. He ended up inviting Betty to join their celebration. It was completely unexpected for the woman, but she accepted the offer. She didn't realize how she'd said yes so quickly, but apparently there was something about this man that was attractive and special. It was the beginning of their relationship. Robert's daughter also became fast friends with Betty. She was old enough to realize that Daddy couldn't live alone all his life either. Therefore, the girl did not interfere with their relationship. It seemed that life had settled down, and now Betty had a calm and bright future ahead of her. But not always in life everything happens exactly as it is desired. Jacob was released only by the winter of the next year. The weather outside was gray and snowy. The man was chilly. He didn't manage to get out of prison before his due date. How did he not try? Father Sam had done a good job of making sure Jacob was left there for the entire term. During the time the man spent in prison and many changes took place. The partner with whom he had made a deal before going to prison turned out to be a corrupt man and canceled all the contracts at the first opportunity. And he did it in such a way that Jacob was left not just without money, but he was a lot of debts from third-party organizations. In order to cover all, the man had to sell his house, car, and other property. The money was barely enough. After that, Jacob was left literally on the street. All former friends turned away from him. After all, no one wanted to get in trouble with the law. Jacob had nowhere to go. For all his troubles, he blamed Betty, of course, because, in the man's opinion, it was all her fault. If she hadn't been such a fool then, now they would both be sitting somewhere on the ocean and enjoying their paradise life. Jacob could not accept this, so he decided to visit his ex-wife. He figured she couldn't have traveled far and was now living in her old apartment. No labor. Remembering the address, the man went there, but he was not opened. Only some woman through the door shouted that she was not Betty, and no such person lived in that apartment. Jacob knocked for a long time, demanding to be let in, but to no avail. After a while, the police arrived with some unknown man. They jointly managed to bring Jacob to the street, where he told them that in this apartment lived his ex-wife, who has now disappeared and has not given any news of herself. Nevertheless, the police had to take the men to the station and make a report on the offense. Jacob's behavior, given that he has only recently been released from prison, did not go unpunished. He was sentenced to 5 days imprisonment. At first, they wanted to charge him with the full amount, but they decided that the man was having too much trouble as it was. During the time Jacob spent in the cell, he figured out a way to find Betty. Since there was no good way to find her, the man decided to file a report that his ex-wife had run away, taking with her a rather large sum of money from the safe. And the evidence is no longer his concern. Even if he couldn't accuse Betty of stealing, he would still know where she was and could take revenge on her for all his troubles. So Jacob did just that. When he was released once again, he first filed a report on the disappearance of a large sum of money and said that no one but his ex-wife could have taken it. The report was accepted and an investigation began. After that, Jacob's main problem became the lack of housing. He, of course, got used to inconveniences for the last year and a half, but he could not live on the street in winter or wander around train stations. He had to get a job as a janitor, because he could not get anywhere else with such a background. The pay was pennies, but it was stable. And he was also given an old lady in the form of a small van where he could live. Jacob was ready to tolerate all the inconveniences, knowing that the time would come and his ex-wife would answer for everything. In the meantime, the police began processing Jacob's application. Coincidentally, his case fell to the very officer who had once put the man behind bars. Kevin immediately latched on to a familiar combination of surnames and names of the defendants, but he couldn't remember them. He had too many people going through him on different matters, and it was simply unrealistic to memorize each one. Betty stood at the airport waiting for her guest. The night before, Sam had called her and said that he had recently returned from Germany and now he really wanted to meet her. The woman immediately invited him to her house because she had long ago promised to invite him to a housewarming party. The airplane arrived on schedule. Very worried, although she herself did not understand why over the years she had developed a warm relationship with this guy. They corresponded a lot, sharing their successes and failures. Betty knew how Sam's rehabilitation was progressing, and he, in turn, knew about the woman's successes at work. Betty preferred not to tell her boyfriend about her personal life. She reminded him that when they first met, Sam had made it clear that he liked her. Betty realized that those feelings had probably faded over time, but she was still afraid of hurting him. After all, Sam was already going through a difficult time in his life. Finally, Betty saw a familiar face among the crowd of passengers. She waved to the guy. Sam saw her, and with a confident gait, he walked toward the woman. She hugged him and gave him a friendly kiss on the cheek. "Wow," Betty marveled. "You're walking so well already, because I've been struggling to recover. And it's all thanks to you." "Why thanks to me?" the woman asked in surprise. "Well, who told me that everything would be fine and life would return to normal?" Sam laughed. "I'm glad I was able to help you overcome these difficulties. Okay, let's go. I'll show you my apartment, and then the city." They got into Betty's car, which she had recently bought on credit. "Wow," Sam was surprised. "You've already learned to drive." "I have. I have to travel a lot for work, and public transportation is not the most convenient option." "And now how did you manage to get away from work?" "Because we're in the middle of a workday, you won't get in trouble for me. I took a vacation for a few days, so I'm completely at your disposal." The woman smiled. They'd reached the apartment. Sam immediately appraised Betty on the accommodation. She had furnished it very nicely. At the same time, there was nothing superfluous there. The woman fed her guest lunch, after which they went for a walk around the city. Betty took Sam to her favorite places, told some stories about this city, which she had managed to learn during her stay in Minnesota. After a long walk, the woman offered her guest to go to a cafe, and at the same time to celebrate their meeting. Sam gladly agreed. During the walk, he was already tired and hungry, and he needed an excuse to confess something to Betty. When they were sitting at a table in a cozy cafe, Betty said she wanted him to meet someone. She had invited Robert and his daughter over for the evening so they could all spend time together. "I thought it would be just the two of us," Sam said with ill-concealed disappointment. "I think you'll like my friends." Vettit glanced at them, pointing at the man and the girl who had entered the cafe. As Robert and Kathy approached the table, Betty introduced them to each other. "Meet my very good friend, comrade, and just a wonderful guy, Sam. And this is my future husband, and Robert and his daughter Kathy." "What husband?" Sam was outraged. "Betty, how could you do this to me?" "Sam, wait, how could I do this to you? I've lived so long to be with you. I realized that you needed a complete man, and just for that, I tried to be a normal person like I was before. And you betrayed me. Why didn't you tell me you had someone else? Why didn't you tell me you didn't need me? Why did you spend so much time giving me hope that we could make it work?" "Sam," Betty said quietly, "what are you talking about? I told you right away that there was no way we could be a couple. There's a huge age difference. I thought you understood that. And in 2 years, all your feelings for me have turned into friendship. I've always thought of you as my friend, but nothing more. You're a very nice, kind, and smart guy. And you need a young girl who's age appropriate for you, not me with a lot of problems and a horrible past. It's up to me to decide who I want and who I don't." Sam jumped up from the table and ran away. Betty wanted to rush after him, but Robert stopped her, saying that now she could only make things worse, and the guy just needed to cool down. So he decided to catch up with Sam himself and talk to him man to man. Robert ran out of the cafe and looked around. Sam was nowhere to be found. It was getting dusk outside, so visibility was somewhat limited. "Excuse me, did you see where the guy who ran out of here a minute ago went?" Robert turned to the man smoking near the entrance to the cafe. The man pointed toward the waterfront. Robert ran after Sam. The man thought the guy couldn't have gotten far. It had only been a couple minutes. And so it was. When Robert found himself on the embankment, he saw a lone figure standing on the bank of the Volga River, staring off into the distance. Sam cautiously called out to him. "What do you want from me?" The guy said angrily. "I wanted to talk, which you've already done everything you can. I've been living my life for the last few years, dreaming that Betty would see me, realize how hard I've worked for her, and be with me. Turns out she never even thought of me as a man who could be her husband." "Listen, boy," Robert said. "You're young. You've got your whole life ahead of you. Betty told me about you and your rehab. You did good. You fought. But what does that have to do with her? There's too much age difference between you two. You're very young. You're hot-blooded, adventurous, exploring. She's got a lot going on in her life, and she wants a quiet life. What makes you think I can't give her that quiet life?" In a calmer voice, asked Sam. "Yes, because I was a young 20-year-old guy myself. I know what it is. I know what it's like. When you want to try everything, I can even understand your attraction to a grown woman. But it'll pass quickly. Trust me on this. I want to live my experience." Sam snapped at me. "You shouldn't say that. Betty is very nice to you. She's always spoken very warmly of you, but she sees you more as a friend in some ways, even as a son. So she can't share your feelings for her. So what do you suggest I do? I flew all the way out here to propose to her. I even bought a ring. I wanted to stay here with her, but now I see that I'm not here anymore. Where am I going?" "Sam, you need to talk to Betty. You two need to work things out together. It'll make you and her feel better. I can't see her. She betrayed me. And you think you're worthy of a grown woman. You sound like a teenager in transition. My advice to you is to find the courage to talk to Betty. She's really worried. And you know that if she wants to stay with you after that conversation, I'll back off and stay out of your way. But you have to talk to her about everything yourself." "Okay," Sam agreed. "You can call her, because my phone was left at the cafe. I don't want to go back there. I'll wait for her at the apartment. I want to talk to her one-on-one. No problem letting you down." "No, you don't." The guy said no. "It's not far, if I remember correctly. It's about 15 minutes on foot." "Thank you." After this conversation, Sam went to Betty's house, and Robert went back to the cafe. On the way, he called Betty and relayed the gist of the conversation. The woman replied that she would go home so that Sam would not arrive before her and wait at the door. There was no telling what might happen to him in a foreign city. She offered to take Kathy with her, but Robert said that his daughter should stay at the cafe and wait for him. After all, Betty needs to talk to Sam one-on-one. The woman quickly got into her car and was home in 5 minutes. Sam wasn't there yet. He didn't show up, not after 10 minutes, not after 20. Betty got worried and started calling Robert to find out what road the guy had gone down and where to look for him. Robert went through town or down the waterfront, like the waterfront, and didn't panic. Maybe he just got a little lost. I mean, you told him the address. If he figures it out, ask people. It's not too late to help him. If he doesn't show up within half an hour, we'll go looking for him. Robert, I can't just sit here and wait. It's winter outside." Then the doorbell rang. Betty asked Robert not to disconnect until she checked to see who was there. The woman looked through the peephole. Sam was standing outside the door. "Robert is here," the woman said as she opened the door locks. "It's okay. Thank you for your help." She thanked him and passed out. When the woman finally conjured up the door, a pungent odor of alcohol hit her nose. "Sam," she exclaimed, "where have you been? What happened?" The guy didn't answer anything. He stepped over the threshold of the house, slammed the door, and kissed Betty passionately right on the lips. It seemed like an eternity in the hall before Sam pulled away from her lips. "What are you doing?" Betty was outraged, pushing the guy away from her. "I love you. How can you not realize that? I want you all to myself. Betty, I'm going to make you the happiest woman on the planet. I've been planning on meeting you for so long. I wanted to impress you with how I overcame all the odds, how I learned to walk again. And it's all just for you. Why won't you give yourself to me? What are you afraid of? I can see that you care about me. Stop it, Sam, stop it. You're in no condition to discuss this subject right now. Betty was shaking with fear. She was afraid that Sam might do something stupid that he would regret. Why don't you go to bed now? Betty tried to speak as gently as possible. And then tomorrow morning you'll wake up and we'll talk about it. No, I don't want to sleep. I want you to give me an answer right here and now. Okay, Betty agreed. Just let's move to the room anyway and talk there. Okay, agreed Sam reluctantly. That's good. Go sit down. And I'll go. I'm telling you we could use some coffee. The guy waved his hand and went deep into the apartment, and Betty sighed faintly in relief. She still had her cell phone in her hand. Walking into the kitchen, the woman quickly typed a message to Robert, "Come to me right away." The reply didn't take long, and Betty quickly ran her eyes over the text. "I'm on my way. I'll be there in 20 minutes. What's wrong?" The woman decided not to respond to the message. She busied herself with making coffee. Not much else could come into Sam's head. 10 minutes later, Betty cautiously came out of the kitchen and quietly went into the room. Sam was sleeping peacefully, stretched out on the couch. The woman also quietly walked back into the kitchen. Now she could calmly answer Robert, "It's okay. When you get there, I'll tell you. Just don't ring the bell." After another 10 minutes, there was a gentle knock at the door. It was Robert. He looked worried. Betty opened the door quietly and led the man into the kitchen, where she told him what had happened. "Did he hurt you?" the man asked angrily. No, it's fine. I told him. He just wanted to tell me how he felt, and he kissed me. That's all he did. While not covering for him. I can all understand. I can even accept your friendship, but I don't want to make it miserable because of him. Rom, really, it's okay. You can stay with me tonight. I'll just call Kathy to let her know. Betty set up the cot she had prepared especially for Sam's arrival, and she and Robert went to bed. The man woke up early in the morning when everyone else was still asleep. He carefully got up from the bunk so as not to wake Betty and made his way to the bathroom. When he returned to the kitchen, the woman was already preparing breakfast, and he hugged her gently from behind and kissed her cheek. "I already can't wait to greet every morning with you," Robert said with a smile. "Me too," Betty said. He got up and walked stiffly to the kitchen, where Betty was sitting, staring out the window, thinking about something. "Hi," the guy said hello quietly. Betty flinched in surprise and looked back at him. "Hello, Betty. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." "Don't be, Sam. I understand perfectly well. Let's close this subject once and for all. Sit down. I'll pour you some coffee." Sam obediently sat down on the chair, and Betty continued, "I want to explain to you once again that I care about you as a friend. I'm worried about you and always have been, probably because I feel guilty about what happened. But I never considered you as my life partner. You're very young, and you have your whole life ahead of you. You can finally realize your dream, become a musician, travel the world. But for that, you need another young, ambitious companion. I'm not cut out for that. I would love to have you in my life. But if you can't change the way you feel about me, then we'd better forget about each other once and for all. It's better for both of us." "I hear you." After a short pause, Sam said, "I think it's probably best if we just stop talking for a while. I'll fly out tonight, and I won't bother you again, at least not anytime soon." Sam drank his coffee, packed his bags, and headed for the airport. Betty offered him a ride, but he declined. "Forgive me for everything and be happy," Sam said. They hugged one last time, and the guy left her apartment, and Betty was left alone with her thoughts. She was sorry to break up their peculiar friendship with Sam, but it was the right thing to do. at least for now. At first, Betty felt very bad about what had happened. She blamed herself for not being able to recognize the guy's feelings right away and for not explaining the impossibility of a love affair between them very clearly. Then Betty was angry at Sam for not wanting to understand the simple truth that a difference of 14 years between a man and a woman is unacceptable for a happy marriage, especially if the woman is older. And now she had calmed down. She no longer blamed herself or Sam. Everything was resolved more or less well, so there was no need to dwell on it. So she decided. During this period, the woman often met Robert, who was always trying to distract her from sad thoughts. That also played a role, and everything seemed to be back to normal. But suddenly, there was a new problem. One afternoon, when Betty was working on a project, a call from an unknown number popped up on her cell phone. Betty didn't see anything suspicious about it. She often received calls from customers and colleagues from other branches, so the woman calmly answered the call. Betty clarified the caller. "Yes, it's me. Senior Lieutenant Chisholm from the police station is bothering you. Could you come to us today?" "What's the matter?" "Disturbing," Betty asked. "You're a person of interest in a case. We need your testimony." "What case?" "Betty, I can't tell you everything over the phone right now. Come down to Precinct 4 and we'll talk about it." "Okay, I'll be there." "What time can I make it?" 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock. Room 102. "Okay." Cell phone rings. Will disconnected the call and began to wonder what this case could be. Why are the police suddenly interested in her? The firm's files were clean. She was sure of that. She hadn't done anything illegal. After a while, an unpleasant conjecture visited her thoughts. She thought that it was her ex-husband who decided to challenge his imprisonment and pin all the blame on her. It was not for nothing that he had threatened her then, and according to the time limit, he should have been released from prison by now. Betty didn't say anything at work about being called to the police. She just pretended to go about her business as usual. On the way to the police station, she called Robert and told him about today's call and her suspicions. The man asked her to keep him informed, and most importantly, not to panic. The woman easily found the right office and knocked on the door. "Come in," she heard from behind the door. "Hello. I got a call today asking me to come in on some business." "Betty." "Yes, please sit down. I'm the one who called you. My name is James." Betty carefully sat down on the chair opposite the policeman and looked at him questioningly. "Please tell me, how long have you lived in Minnesota?" The officer began his interrogation. "About 2 years." "Wait a minute. Maybe I should get a lawyer. I don't want any trouble, and I don't want you to accuse me of anything when I can't defend myself." Betty chose a defensive position. "Betty, you can have a lawyer, of course, but I'm not accusing you of anything yet. I'm just getting some details." Betty didn't say anything to that. She looked at her interlocutor in silence. "We can continue." "Yes, but if I don't like it, I can refuse." "To answer your questions, of course you can, but I strongly encourage you to speak up. I really do. It's in your best interest." "Okay, I hear you. Let's continue. Where do you live?" "In my apartment, which I bought when I moved to Minnesota." "And how did you buy the apartment?" "I sold my apartment in another city and used the money to buy a place here." "And you can document that?" "Naturally. I have all the documents in order. But of course, I do not carry them with me. So they are at home." "And the car was purchased with what funds?" "It was bought on credit." "The documents confirming this are also at home." "Betty, please don't take me personally. I'm not going to accuse you of anything. I'm just trying to get a picture. Then maybe you can tell me what's going on and what happened. Tell me, are you familiar with Jacob?" Betty flinched at the name of her ex-husband. She knew right away that he'd done it, but she didn't know what he was up to yet. "It's my ex-husband," Betty replied in a trembling voice. "You see, the thing is, a few days ago, we received a request from your hometown. Jacob claims that a large sum of money is missing from his safe, and he named you as the only suspect. Since no one else was in his house during his absence, But that's nonsense. Betty was indignant. I ran away from this house right after he was put in jail. I hardly even took my things. Betty, please calm down. We're going to get to the bottom of this. You're not facing any charges yet. To be honest, he himself couldn't provide any proof that no one else was in the house or that the money was stolen at all. It's all in his own words, but we'll be sure to check it out. Thank you for your cooperation. Please stay in touch. I don't want to restrict your freedom in any way right now, so I just ask you not to leave town. Especially if you have nothing to do. You have nothing to fear. James said goodbye to Betty, and the woman left the station. She felt very bad. Jacob sat in the office of Kevin, who had called him in to get more information. After the results of Betty's interrogation came back from Minnesota, Jacob had a nasty smile on his face. He felt that his plan had worked and the police had found Betty. Now there was only one thing left to do. We needed to get his ex-wife's cell phone number, or better yet, her address. We spoke to your wife, Jacob. She claimed she had nothing to do with your money, and we have no reason to distrust her. Well, of course she has nothing to do with it, Jacob replied mockingly. And you thought she would confess everything to you right away. Yes, I stole all the money from my husband, and now I'm living at my pleasure while he's rotting away on his lousy salary. Jacob, I'm gonna have to ask you to watch your language. Let's have a straight talk. I wonder what Jacob was smirking about. You never forgave your wife for not covering for you in the car accident case, and now you want her to suffer too. Isn't that right? Kevin spent a long time trying to remember why this man looked so familiar. He checked the database, pulled up old cases, and it all came together. This was the man who had caused a drunken accident, nearly killed a young man, and then wanted to frame his wife. What kind of nonsense is that? Jacob was outraged. I need her. Just let her give back what she stole from me. Do you understand, Jacob, what the matter is? Kevin began to speak in a very low voice. You couldn't give us any proof that you even had the money, much less that your ex-wife could be involved in this case. Admit it, there was no theft, right? And I can at least see Betty answering questions about my money with annoyance. Asked Jacob. No, I can't give you that information. It is confidential and has no value to you. How dare you with feigned emotion? Jacob said, and immediately clutched at his heart. You can at least ask for silence, he added, making a painful grimace. Jacob realized that he was acting like all the other young ladies in a cheap show, but nevertheless, his game gave the desired result. Kevin reluctantly got up from his seat and walked out into the hallway to the water killer. Despite the fact that the distance from the office was small, Jacob had enough of this time to find the necessary information in the folders lying on the table with his case. Among the other papers was a sheet of Betty's data. He quickly snapped a picture of them on his cell phone and slammed the folder shut, putting it back down. At the same second, Kevin returned as well. Here you go. The man held out a glass of water. Thank you, Jacob replied. He drank the water in one gulp. You know, you're right. I was just trying to get back at my wife for my broken fate. But you're the one who broke it. Yeah, you don't have to continue your investigation. I don't care. Let him go to hell with the money. Kevin wanted to say something, but Jacob had already left his office. The man went outside and with a triumphant look on his face headed for his old lady. I told you you wouldn't hide from me. He was spoiling everything under his breath. Jacob, wait for me to visit. My dear, I'll meet you soon. After that, the man packed his modest belongings, took out the money he had saved lately, and went to the airport. He had no plans to go back. There was nothing else keeping him in this town. He wanted to get to his ex-wife as soon as possible, so he wasn't going to waste time on the train, especially since the ticket price for these modes of transportation did not differ much. Jacob bought a ticket for the nearest flight, and in 3 hours he sat in the airplane, anticipating his meeting with his ex-wife. It was a cold February evening outside. Betty was at home and was going to meet Robert. He invited her to the theater for the premiere of the play The man was supposed to stop by, wilted, and half an hour later, the doorbell suddenly rang. Something you said early, sick, opening the door. But when she saw Jacob on the doorstep, she froze in horror. Who were you expecting? Someone else, my dear. Jacob roughly pushed Betty into the apartment, then entered and slammed the door behind him. What are you doing here? Barely breathing, Betty asked. What do you mean? Jacob grinned. I came to see my favorite wife. I see you're greeting me in full dress. How did you find me? But I told you I'd do it no matter how you hid. And I'm never one to mince words. What do you want? You robbed me of everything. After I got out of prison, I had to sell everything to pay off the debts my last partner left me in the graveyard of my business. After that, I had to live in a stinking gatehouse and sweep the damn yards every morning. All just to find you. I first wanted to file a missing persons report on you, but they turned me down. So I figured out a way to get those stupid cops to come after you. Then it was just a matter of time, although I had to use my acting talent. Stubborn cop wouldn't give me your info, but as you can see, I'm here for you. Jacob, what do you want? We haven't been husband and wife for a long time. I tried to speak as calmly as I could. The woman was stalling because Robert was going to be here any minute, and Betty really hoped he could fix the problem. It's okay. We'll marry Panova. I don't have a place to live anymore, thanks to you. And no one will hire me either. So I'm staying here on your full support. I fed you, clothed you, taken you to resorts. Now it's your turn. What are you talking about? I have a fiancé, and he'll be here soon. Oh, you scared me, Jacob said with a sneer. Let them try to come here. I'll break every bone in his body. At that moment, the doorbell rang. Betty wanted to go and open it, but Jacob wouldn't let her. Don't you dare. I'm tired right now and I don't want to talk to anyone. Let her go. But the doorbell continued to ring insistently. At the same time, Betty's cell phone rang. Answer it and tell her you're not going anywhere. I have nothing to lose. Understood? Betty nodded her head and hit the answer button. I'm sorry, I'm not feeling very well. I got a headache and fell asleep. Look, let's postpone our trip to the theater. I'm really not feeling very well right now. Betty, I've been standing on the doorstep for 10 minutes. Do you want to let me in? Box. I'm sorry, I look awful, and I don't want you to see me like this. Let's meet tomorrow. But maybe you need some medicine. No, thank you. I love you and I love you, but I'll call you in the morning. Robert disconnected the call and went to the elevator. Jacob watched through the peephole. Well done. You did the right thing. Now let's go to the kitchen. She's hungry. Betty obediently led her ex-husband to the table and began to warm his dinner. Jacob smugly watched the woman. After a while, she put a plate of pasta and a glass of juice in front of him. Don't you have anything to drink? No, Betty answered briefly. Not good. All right, sit down. Let's eat too. I'm sick of eating alone. I don't want to. The woman tried to object. And the hedgehog? I said. Jacob shouted and pounded his fist on the table. Betty flinched in surprise and obediently placed the same plate in front of her. After dinner, Jacob said he wanted to go to bed. Betty tried to linger in the kitchen to wash the dishes, but the man would not let her do so and told her to go with him to his room. Betty made the bed. Jacob unceremoniously laid down on top of her. Lie down, he commanded Betty. But I can at least take a shower, she asked timidly. That's the last thing I need. Are you going to go now, or are you running away from me? And I'm too tired to wait for you there. But after a short pause, Jacob added, although go only undress here. Why? Betty asked in horror. I want to see. Not added and fat. Jacob laughed. I need that slim wife. What are you talking about? Tears started to come to Betty's eyes. Don't be an idiot, like nothing ever happened between us. You know, I haven't even cheated on you once in all these years. You're the last woman I had sex with, so you can imagine how hungry I am for a woman's warmth. Betty was already sobbing at the top of her voice. She was scared and disgusted at the same time. And most importantly, she didn't know how to find a way out of this situation. "Shut up." Jacob jumped up to her and slapped her painfully on the cheek. The woman immediately shut up and looked at him with eyes full of hatred. "Take off your clothes." In a commanding voice, Jacob repeated his order. Betty began to slowly remove her clothes. Jacob just watched this spectacle from the sidelines. 5 minutes later, Betty stood before him completely naked. "Please, can I take a shower?" she moaned pitifully. "You have 3 minutes," Jacob bellowed. "And don't do anything stupid." The man went back to bed, and Betty ran to the bathroom, quietly, opening the locks on the front door on the way. She herself didn't know how it would help her in this situation, but the woman hoped for a miracle. Betty walked into the bathroom and closed the door. Time was not on her side. What to do now and how to get out of this situation? She had no idea. Words were simply impossible to get through to Jacob. At least not now. He hadn't wanted to listen to Betty before, even when they were still married. And now that the man thought she was to blame for all his problems, he simply wouldn't talk to her. "I had to run." It was the only way out. Quickly, cautiously opened the door. It was dark all around, and Jacob was nowhere to be seen. The woman tiptoed through the door and headed for the exit, as she suddenly heard the mocking voice of her ex-husband. Far out. Betty was stunned with horror. She realized that this was the end. There would be no more opportunity for her to escape. "Jacob, listen." Betty began to speak, trying to appeal to her ex-husband's reason. "Don't do this. I'm begging you. You're not like this. Maybe I wasn't before you put me in jail, but I am now. Jacob, it's not my fault you're in jail. You caused that accident. You drove drunk. I was just talking about the police. How did it go down? I never meant to hurt you. Of course you didn't. If you hadn't, you wouldn't have run off like a rat. I asked you for help. I had a lot of money back then, and it was realistic to get me out of jail. But you wouldn't do it. You chose to run away from me, leaving me to deal with my own problems. You made your own choices, and now you're gonna have to pay me back. I've provided for you for so many years. You'll give me every penny. Now enough with the words. Let's get back to the case." He had no plans to go back. There was nothing else keeping him in this town. He wanted to get to his ex-wife as soon as possible, so he wasn't going to waste time on the train, especially since the ticket price for these modes of transportation did not differ much. Jacob bought a ticket for the nearest flight, and in 3 hours he sat in the airplane, anticipating his meeting with his ex-wife. It was a cold February evening outside. Betty was at home and was going to meet Robert. He invited her to the theater for the premiere of the play. The man was supposed to stop by, wilted, and half an hour later, the doorbell suddenly rang. "Something you said early, sick," opening the door. But when she saw Jacob on the doorstep, she froze in horror. "Who were you expecting?" "Someone else, my dear." Jacob roughly pushed Betty into the apartment, then entered and slammed the door behind him. "What are you doing here?" "Barely breathing," Betty asked. "What do you mean?" Jacob grinned. "I came to see my favorite wife. I see you're greeting me in full dress. How did you find me? But I told you I'd do it no matter how you hid. And I'm never one to mince words. What do you want? You robbed me of everything. After I got out of prison, I had to sell everything to pay off the debts my last partner left me in the graveyard of my business. After that, I had to live in a stinking gatehouse and sweep the damn yards every morning. All just to find you. I first wanted to file a missing persons report on you, but they turned me down. So I figured out a way to get those stupid cops to come after you. Then it was just a matter of time, although I had to use my acting talent. Stubborn cop wouldn't give me your info, but as you can see, I'm here for you. Jacob, what do you want? We haven't been husband and wife for a long time." I tried to speak as calmly as I could. The woman was stalling, because Robert was going to be here any minute, and Betty really hoped he could fix the problem. "It's okay. We'll marry Panova. I don't have a place to live anymore, thanks to you. And no one will hire me either. So I'm staying here on your full support. I fed you, clothed you, taken you to resorts. Now it's your turn. What are you talking about? I have a fiancé, and he'll be here soon. Oh, you scared me, Jacob said with a sneer. Let them try to come here. I'll break every bone in his body. At that moment, the doorbell rang. Betty wanted to go and open it, but Jacob wouldn't let her. Don't you dare. I'm tired right now and I don't want to talk to anyone. Let her go. But the doorbell continued to ring insistently. At the same time, Betty's cell phone rang. Answer it and tell her you're not going anywhere. I have nothing to lose. Understood? Betty nodded her head and hit the answer button. I'm sorry, I'm not feeling very well. I got a headache and fell asleep. Look, let's postpone our trip to the theater. I'm really not feeling very well right now. Betty, I've been standing on the doorstep for 10 minutes. Do you want to let me in? Box. I'm sorry, I look awful, and I don't want you to see me like this. Let's meet tomorrow. But maybe you need some medicine. No, thank you. I love you and I love you, but I'll call you in the morning. Robert disconnected the call and went to the elevator. Jacob watched through the peephole. Well done. You did the right thing. Now let's go to the kitchen. She's hungry. Betty obediently led her ex-husband to the table and began to warm his dinner. Jacob smugly watched the woman. After a while, she put a plate of pasta and a glass of juice in front of him. Don't you have anything to drink? No, Betty answered briefly. As for Jacob, he was prosecuted for attempted rape. The evidence was overwhelming, plus the testimony of Robert and neighbors who heard screams, as well as characteristic marks on Betty's body. However, after a forensic psychiatric examination, it was found that the man had certain deviations. According to the court decision, he was sent to a psychiatric hospital for compulsory treatment, where he is likely to remain, if not for life, then for a very long period of time.